Hey there, fellow philosopher. If you're anything like me, you love wrestling with those big foundational questions, those concepts that really push the limits of what we can wrap our heads around.
Yeah, those questions that keep you up at night.
Exactly. And today we're diving deep into one that has captivated thinkers for centuries: omnipresence.
Ah, omnipresence.
More specifically, divine omnipresence, the idea that God is present everywhere. And for this deep dive, we're turning to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, well, omnipresence.
It's a great resource, very comprehensive and, rigorous, as you'd expect from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It lays out all the different philosophical angles and approaches to this concept.
And right off the bat, as a philosopher, I think the first question that pops up is how can an immaterial being like God, as understood in classical theism, be present in space? I mean, if something doesn't have a physical body, how can it be located anywhere, let alone everywhere?
Yeah, that's the paradox, right? The very idea seems to defy our basic intuitions about space and presence.
It does, and that's precisely what makes this such a fascinating philosophical puzzle. So, in this deep dive, we're going to unpack those different philosophical approaches, trace the historical roots of this concept, and explore how thinkers have tried to make sense of it all.
We'll look at traditional frameworks, contemporary proposals, the whole shebang.
Sounds good. All right, let's start with the historical groundwork. It's interesting to note that this idea of divine omnipresence has deep roots in scripture, not just in philosophical treatises.
Absolutely. We find powerful expressions of it way back in the Psalms, like Psalm 139, which asks, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there." It's a pretty powerful statement, right?
Yeah, there's this sense of inescapable presence no matter where you go, no matter how far you try to run. There's no escaping God's presence, even in the depths of Sheol.
Right. And these scriptural ideas formed the foundation for early theological giants like Augustine to wrestle with this concept. Now, Augustine was very careful to distinguish divine presence from the way, say, physical objects take up space.
Yeah, like my coffee cup is here, but it's not also over there.
Exactly. Augustine was really concerned with avoiding what he called carnal ideas.
Yeah,
He didn't want people thinking of God as physically spread out,
yeah.
like a kind of divine gas filling up the universe.
The God-shaped balloon.
He explicitly says not distributed through all things by a sort of extension of size, as earth or water or air or light are distributed. God's presence is something fundamentally different. So Augustine is already pushing us to think beyond our ordinary understanding of being somewhere.
He even used an analogy comparing God's presence to the presence of the soul within the body.
He did. He pointed out that physical objects, well, they have parts. Like a piece of your coffee cup is not in the same place as another piece of your coffee cup.
Yeah.
It can't be wholly present in every part of the space it occupies. But the soul, Augustine argued, and even more so God, knows how to be wholly everywhere without being confined to any place. So this idea of being wholly present is key. It's distinct from how material objects exist in space.
It's a different kind of presence altogether.
Absolutely. And then we come to Anselm, who I think it's fair to say kind of took this to an even more paradoxical level. He stated that God exists in every place and at all times, but also in the same breath, God exists in no place and at no time. Now that's a head scratcher.
As a philosopher, that definitely gets my attention.
It does, doesn't it? But Anselm, clever as he was, sought to resolve this apparent contradiction by distinguishing two ways of being wholly in a place.
Okay, I'm listening.
So for material objects, he said their magnitude place contains by circumscribing it, and circumscribes by containing it. They are defined by the space they occupy. But God, he argued, isn't like that. God is present as a whole in every different place at once, but without being circumscribed by those places. He's not limited by space in the way a physical object is.
Okay, so it's a presence but not a containment. A very subtle but important distinction.
Exactly. God's being there is radically different from how, say, this microphone is here on the table. And later interpretations of Anselm, like those by Wirunga, Leftow, and Kahn, further explore this idea of being present as a whole.
Yeah, the text mentions them briefly. What were their takes on this?
Well, Wirunga, for example, suggested that for Anselm, it's all about knowledge. God's being wholly present could be understood through God's knowing or sensing everything everywhere.
So God's knowledge is the key to his omnipresence.
In a way, yeah. Leftow, on the other hand, focused on God's power. For him, God is present everywhere by virtue of his power being active everywhere.
So God's ability to act, to exert his power, that's what constitutes his presence.
Exactly. And Khan, he brings in the element of time alongside space, emphasizing a more holistic view where God sort of contains all of space-time, not just individual locations.
Interesting. So we have knowledge, power, and now the whole of space-time. These early thinkers were really grappling with the implications of this idea, and their ideas laid the groundwork for more systematic accounts, like the influential triad of power, knowledge, and essence that Thomas Aquinas championed.
Yeah, Aquinas, building on Peter Lombard, really systematized this notion. He argued that God is present in all things in three ways: by his power, by his knowledge, and by his essence.
Okay, unpack that a bit for me. What did he mean by each of those?
So by power, it means everything is subject to God's power. God has the ability to influence everything everywhere.
So it's like a king ruling over his kingdom. Even if the king isn't physically present in every corner of the kingdom, his power extends everywhere.
That's the analogy Aquinas used, yeah. Then presence by knowledge. It means everything is open to God's knowledge. God knows everything that's happening everywhere, all the time.
Like if you can see everything in a room, even though you're not touching everything, you're still aware of it all. Everything in the room is present to your awareness.
Exactly, and Aquinas used that very analogy. And finally, presence by essence. This one's a bit more abstract. It ties God's presence to his role as the fundamental cause of existence for everything.
So everything that exists because of God. God's essence is somehow present in everything, making its existence possible.
That's the gist of it, yeah. It's important to note, though, that this view understands the phrase is present, when applied to God, to be analogical, not literal.
Right. We're not saying God is present in the same way this microphone is present on the table.
Precisely. We're talking about a related but different meaning.
And this analogical approach, well, it wasn't without its critics, right?
Oh, of course not. You always have critics.
Like Everett, for example. The text mentions that he questioned the whole idea of analogical presence.
Yeah, he argued that if God's presence isn't literal, then maybe it's more accurate to say God isn't actually omnipresent in the common sense of the word.
So he's pushing for a more literal understanding of omnipresence.
Yeah, he's saying if it's not literal, then what are we even talking about? But then you have others like Hoffman and Rosencrantz who defended the analogical approach.
So they acknowledge that God isn't present literally in every place, but they still saw value in the analogy.
They argued it still helps us understand God's relationship to the world. And of course, later on, we'll see Hudson, who went the opposite direction and argued for a literal omnipresence.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to unpack later. It's fascinating how this simple phrase, is present, can have such different interpretations and lead to very different understandings of omnipresence.
Oh, absolutely. And it's worth bringing in another point from Anselm that was echoed by some medieval thinkers. They suggested it might be more accurate to say God is present in all existing things rather than just in all places.
So the focus shifts from empty space to the things that occupy space.
Exactly. It's more about God's relationship to creation itself.
Okay, so that's a good overview of some early and medieval perspectives. Now, moving into more recent and contemporary treatments of this concept, the text highlights Charles Hartshorne, who proposed this really interesting analogy of God's relationship to the world as a mind to its body.
Yeah, a very intimate connection, you could say.
It does suggest a very close, almost inseparable relationship. And he developed this by making some distinctions within the concepts of knowledge and power.
Right. He distinguished between immediate and indirect knowledge and direct and indirect power. And he argued that God possesses the highest form of both, meaning God has immediate, infallible knowledge of the entire cosmos. He doesn't have to rely on anything to know what's going on. And he has direct control over everything, every single part of the universe, even the empty spaces.
Okay, so God's knowledge is perfect and complete, and his power is direct and unmediated.
Exactly. And based on this, he came to a pretty bold conclusion.
Which is, drumroll please,
that the world is God's body.
Wow, that's a pretty radical claim. So the universe, everything in it, even the empty spaces, constitute God's body.
That's what Hartshorne argued, yeah. His reasoning was that whatever a mind knows immediately and controls directly is, by definition, its body. And since God has that kind of relationship with the universe, well, the universe qualifies as his body.
It's an interesting idea for sure. But, as a philosopher, I have to ask, is it really that simple? Can we just equate the universe to God's body based on those two criteria?
Well, as you might imagine, that idea faced some pushback. Richard Swinburne, for example, initially entertained the idea of a limited embodiment, but he later withdrew it.
What was his take on it?
Well, Swinburne ultimately settled on a view that focuses on basic action and direct knowledge.
So what did he mean by those terms?
By basic action, he meant that God can directly cause effects at every place without needing any intermediary mechanisms.
So God can act anywhere, instantly, without having to rely on anything else to carry out his actions.
Exactly. And by direct knowledge, he meant that God knows what's happening everywhere without needing any chain of information, any sensory input, or anything like that. It's immediate and unmediated knowledge.
So it's like saying God doesn't need to see something to know it's happening. He just knows.
Precisely. And he explicitly saw his view as being in the spirit of Aquinas, focusing on God's power and knowledge.
Okay, so it's a more refined version of the traditional power and knowledge approach. But this whole idea of the world as God's body or any form of divine embodiment faced some pretty strong objections, didn't it?
It did. Taliaferro, for example, raised concerns about the huge difference in complexity between, say, a human being raising their arm and the kind of direct action God would be performing across the entire universe.
Yeah, like when I raise my arm, there's a whole chain of events happening in my body, signals being sent through nerves, muscles contracting, and so on. It's a complex physical process. But God's actions, according to this view, wouldn't involve any of that.
Exactly. Taliaferro argued that the lack of complex physical machinery in God's actions makes it difficult to really compare the universe to a human body. The analogy breaks down.
And Waringa had another interesting objection. He pointed out that if God's knowledge and power extend to empty space in the same way as to regions occupied by matter, then defining God's body based solely on these attributes becomes problematic.
Right. Why would empty space be considered part of God's body?
Exactly. And that leads us to some alternative modern proposals that try to tackle this issue in some really interesting ways. Some of them get pretty wild, metaphysically speaking.
Oh, yeah. Some of them really push the boundaries.
Like Robert Oakes, for example, suggested that space itself is actually constituted by God's omnipresence. He wants to maintain a clear distinction between God and the world, but he does it in a really interesting way.
Yeah. Instead of God being in space, he's saying that God's presence actually defines what space is.
That's a really different way of thinking about it. It's a complete reversal of our usual perspective.
It is. God's being present everywhere isn't just about being located within a pre-existing space.
Mhm.
It's somehow foundational to the very nature of spatiality itself.
That's a pretty mind-bending concept.
It is. And it allows Oakes to avoid pantheism. The idea that God and the universe are one and the same. God remains distinct from creation, but God is also foundational to its spatial existence.
Okay, and then we have Luco Johann van den Braam, who came up with this wild idea of a higher dimensional analogy. This one sounds like something straight out of a science fiction novel.
Yeah, it kind of does. He proposed that God exists in a spatial dimension beyond our familiar three dimensions.
Like a fourth dimension, or even higher.
Exactly, and he used this analogy. Just as a two-dimensional plane is present at every point on a one-dimensional line within it, and a three-dimensional space is present at every point on a two-dimensional plane within it, so God, existing in a higher dimensional space, is present in all the locations of our three-dimensional cosmos without being contained by it.
Wow. So God is present everywhere in our three dimensions because he exists in a higher dimension that encompasses our entire space. It's like saying a flat sheet of paper exists everywhere along a straight line drawn on it because the paper is bigger than the line.
Exactly. And he even suggested that we'd need at least two extra spatial dimensions for this analogy to work.
So we're talking 5 dimensions at least. Now that's some next level metaphysics right there.
It definitely is. It's a very creative way to try to get around this problem of an immaterial being located in space.
It is. And then, of course, we have Hud Hudson, who gave us this really interesting and very technical account of ubiquitous intention.
Ah, yes, ubiquitous intention.
This one really delves into the nitty-gritty of metaphysics.
It does. And it introduces these terms intention and pertension that we need to wrap our heads around.
Right. What's the difference between those two?
So intention is when something is wholly and entirely located at a region and every subregion of that region.
Okay, so it's not just being present in a general area, it's being present in every single part of that area.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with pertension, which is how typical material objects occupy space. Their parts are spread out, like my car has an engine in one place, wheels in another, and so on.
So it's about the difference between a uniform whole and a collection of parts.
That's a good way to put it. And Hudson's radical proposal is that omnipresence is God literally intending the maximally inclusive region. So God is wholly present in every single part of space,
Yeah.
without any parts of him being separate from other parts.
So God's presence is like that uniform block of gold. Every single part of it is gold, through and through.
Exactly. No matter how small a piece you take, it's still all gold.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But there's a bit of a controversial consequence to this view, isn't there?
There is, yeah. In Hudson's framework, anything that occupies space in this way, through intention, is considered a material object. So his view seems to imply that God is material.
So God, the immaterial being, is actually a material object, according to this view.
That's the implication, yeah.
Hmm.
And Hudson is fine with that, but other philosophers, not so much. Ross Inman, for example, while agreeing with the idea of intention as a way to understand omnipresence, rejects the idea of God's materiality. He points back to medieval distinctions between material and immaterial objects, arguing that even with intention, God wouldn't necessarily be considered material according to those frameworks.
Okay, so there's room for debate even within this very specific and technical account of omnipresence. And then we have Eleanor Stump, who brings in a whole other dimension to this discussion, the relational dimension.
Yeah, she adds these really crucial elements of second-person experience and shared attention to the traditional understanding, especially in the context of a loving God.
So it's not just about God knowing about us or being able to act upon us, it's about a deeper, more personal connection.
Exactly. She argues that for genuine presence, especially in a theological sense, there needs to be more than just those cognitive and causal connections. There needs to be this awareness of and attention to the other as a person, which she calls second-person experience.
So it's like, I can know facts about you, and I can even do things that affect you, but that's not the same as truly being present with you, acknowledging you as a person, and paying attention to you.
Right. And she also emphasizes the importance of shared attention, the mutual awareness that both parties are attending to each other. So for God to be truly omnipresent in a meaningful way, he needs to be in a position to share attention with any creature that's willing to do so.
That's a really interesting addition to this whole discussion. It brings in this element of relationship and mutuality that I think is often missing from more abstract accounts of omnipresence.
It does. And George Gasser picks up on this idea of a more active and relational presence. He emphasizes God's agency and his ability to act, especially in different places.
So it's not just about God being present everywhere in a uniform way. It's about his ability to interact in specific and unique ways to respond to the needs of his creation.
Exactly. Gasser was initially drawn to Hudson's intention idea, but he ultimately found it hard to reconcile with the idea of God acting differently in different places, like we see in biblical accounts of miracles, for example.
So he's saying that omnipresence needs to account for not just God's knowledge and power being everywhere, but also his ability to intervene in specific ways.
Right. It's a more dynamic view of omnipresence. And finally, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry talks about future directions for philosophical inquiry in this area, and they point out something really important.
What's that?
Well, they note that most of the philosophical work on omnipresence has focused on Western and monotheistic traditions.
So we've been looking at it largely from a Judeo-Christian Islamic perspective.
Exactly. And they suggest that future research should explore other perspectives, like those of ancient philosophers, early modern thinkers, and even non-Western philosophical traditions.
That makes a lot of sense. There's a whole world of thought out there that we haven't even touched on.
There is. And they also mention their own proposal involving the omnipresence of even numbers and pure sets, which is a pretty wild idea designed to really shake things up.
Yeah, that one's definitely out there. But it does highlight the need to really question our assumptions about what omnipresence could even mean.
Exactly. So to sum up this deep dive, we've journeyed from the biblical foundations of omnipresence through Augustine's early attempts to distinguish it from material presence, Anselm's mind-bending paradoxes and his attempts to resolve them, Aquinas' influential triad of power, knowledge, and essence, the more recent debates around divine embodiment with thinkers like Hartshorne and Swinburne, and finally, those really innovative and sometimes quite radical proposals from contemporary philosophers like Oakes, Van den Braam, Hudson, Stump, and Gasser. It's been a wild ride through the history of thought on this concept.
It has. And, you know, as philosophers, we can really appreciate the complexity and depth of this topic. We've seen how it touches on so many fundamental questions about metaphysics, ontology, the nature of reality itself. How can an immaterial being be present in space? How does God relate to his creation? What does it even mean to be present?
Huge questions, no easy answers.
Exactly. So after this deep dive, I'm curious, how has your own thinking about God's relationship to the universe been shaped or maybe even challenged? What do you make of these different accounts of omnipresence, and how might these different conceptualizations affect our own understanding of presence, connection, and even meaning in a world that can be understood in so many different ways? These are questions worth pondering even long after this deep dive has ended.
Food for thought indeed.